In the hallways of Cedar Ridge High School, a quiet Korean-American senior was about to face the cruelest moment of her high school career. What started as a simple dress approval for graduation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the school's most vicious bullies. Hana Lee wasn't your typical invisible student. For over a decade, she had spent her life training in Taekwondo under her late father's guidance, known for her disciplined silence and hidden strength that no one at school could imagine. When she encountered Avery Daniels and her clique wielding scissors against her handmade hanbok-style dress, she had no idea they were about to unleash a warrior they never knew existed. Hana's response, choosing restraint over revenge, mercy over violence, that would lead to a viral reckoning that exposed their cruelty to the world. What began as an act of cultural destruction would become a masterclass in true power. The small Texas town would never be the same after witnessing a girl who could have destroyed her. Tormentors instead choose to forgive them, teaching an entire community the difference between being popular and being powerful. The bullies thought they were shredding fabric. They had no idea they were forging steel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hana Lee moved through the hallways of Cedar Ridge, high like morning mist, invisible until the sun burned it away, and she preferred it that way. Had learned to perfect the art of being unseen in the 3 years since her family moved to this small Texas town, where pickup trucks outnumbered Priuses 10-1, and her Korean features marked her as different. In a place that celebrated sameness, she kept her dark hair long and straight, letting it fall like a curtain over her face when she walked, head down, backpack clutched tight against her chest, navigating between the clusters of loud, confident teenagers who seemed to own the world while she merely borrowed space in it. The final week of senior year buzzed with an electric energy that made Hana's skin crawl. Everyone talking about graduation parties and college plans and summer adventures, their voices echoing off the beige lockers. In a symphony of excitement she couldn't join, she had her own plans, quiet ones that involved helping her mother, Yoonji, at the Seoul laundromat on Main Street, where they washed and pressed the clothes of people who barely acknowledged their existence, but paid their bills on time, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because invisible girls like Hana didn't get to want more than enough. But tonight was different. Tonight, she sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, watching her mother's weathered hands work magic with needle and thread, transforming yards of silk, the color of cherry blossoms, into something that made Hana's heart flutter with a feeling she couldn't name. The dress, her mother called it hanbok-style, but modernized for American. Graduation ceremony was everything Hana had dreamed of but never dared to ask for. The bodice fitted and elegant with traditional Korean knots along the shoulders, the skirt flowing like water with subtle embroidery that told the story of their family in golden thread. Your father would be proud, Yoonji said without looking up, her English still careful after 15 years in Texas, each word chosen with the precision she applied to her stitching. This dress, it honors our family, honors you. Her voice caught slightly on the word father, the way it always did, and Hana felt the familiar ache in her chest, the hollow space where Kim Jae-sung should have been there to see his daughter graduate, should have been there to walk her down the aisle, someday should have been there to continue teaching her the discipline that had shaped her into someone stronger than she appeared. Hana closed her eyes and could almost feel his presence in the way her mother's hands moved, in the way her own muscles remembered the forms he'd taught her since she was 6 years old, when grief was too big for words and movement became prayer. The memory of his voice echoing in her mind. Strength is not in the fist, Hana, it is in knowing when not to use it. He died in a car accident when she was 14, taken by a drunk driver on Highway 35, but his lessons lived in her body, in the way she breathed, in the way she balanced, in the way she could break a board with her bare hands. Though no one at Cedar Ridge High would ever guess that quiet Hana Lee could fight. The dress was almost finished now, and as her mother held it up against Hana's frame, both women fell silent, seeing not just fabric and thread, but possibility, transformation, the chance for Hana to step out of the shadows for one night, to honor her heritage and her father's memory, to be seen as she truly was, instead of the ghost she'd trained herself to become. "Tomorrow I bring to school for approval," her mother said, though they both knew the dress followed all the guidelines: modest length, appropriate neckline, no controversial messages. Unless pride in one's culture counted as controversial, which in this town it sometimes did, "you will be beautiful, Hana, most beautiful girl at graduation." Hana nodded, though beautiful wasn't a word she associated with herself. She was practical, serviceable, like the sensible shoes she wore, and the plain ponytails that kept her hair out of her face. But something about the way the silk caught the light, something about the way the embroidered flowers seemed to bloom across the fabric, made her think, maybe, just maybe, her mother might be right. At school the next day, she carried herself differently. Still quiet, still careful, but with something new beneath the surface, a tiny flame of anticipation that she tried to keep hidden. She noticed Liam Alvarez watching her during third period debate class, his dark eyes curious as she argued her point about immigration policy with more passion than usual. And when he nodded approvingly, she felt heat rise in her cheeks, quickly looked away. But she also noticed Avery Daniels watching too, the blonde dance team captain, whose father sat on the school board, whose smile could cut glass, and whose very presence seemed to shrink the air around other girls. Avery, who ruled Cedar Ridge High with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she belonged, never had to fight to be seen. Their eyes met across the hallway after lunch, and for a moment, Hana saw something flicker in Avery's perfect blue gaze. Recognition, maybe, or calculation, the way a predator sizes up potential prey. Before Avery turned away with a dismissive toss of her platinum hair, leaving Hana with the uncomfortable feeling that she'd somehow drawn attention she never wanted. That night, as her mother put the finishing touches on the dress, adding tiny seed pearls to the collar, Hana tried to shake the feeling of being watched, of being evaluated, and found wanting. She told herself it didn't matter what Avery Daniels thought, told herself that graduation was just one day, and then she'd be free to disappear into whatever came next, college maybe, or helping her mother expand the laundromat into the empty space next door. But deep in her chest, where her father's lessons lived, were the memory of his hands, guiding hers through forms and breathing exercises, had taken root. Something whispered that change was coming, whether she wanted it or not, that the quiet life she'd built was about to shatter like glass. And when it did, she'd have to choose between staying invisible or standing in the light. The dress hung in her locker like a secret made of silk and dreams. Hana had brought it to school Tuesday morning for the mandatory graduation attire check, her hands trembling slightly as she zipped it into the garment bag her mother had sewn from leftover fabric. Everything about it was perfect, from the careful measurements to the hand-stitched buttonholes to the way it smelled faintly of jasmine tea from their apartment above the laundromat, where Yoonji worked late into the night, breathing life into cloth. She was closing her locker when Liam appeared beside her, his messenger bag slung across his broad shoulders, his dark hair slightly mussed from the Texas wind that never seemed to stop blowing through their small town. "Hey, Hana," he said, and his voice was warm honey over gravel, the kind of voice that made girls stop and listen. But he was talking to her invisible Hana, who usually merited nothing more than polite nods in the hallway. "Hi," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, but he leaned closer as if her quiet words were worth hearing, as if she had something valuable to say. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday in debate class about cultural assimilation versus integration," he continued, his eyes bright with genuine interest. "You made some really insightful points about maintaining identity while adapting to new environments. It was brilliant, actually." Hana felt heat creep up her neck, because no one ever called her brilliant. No one ever remembered what she said in class, let alone thought about it afterward. "Thank you," she said, and for once didn't duck her head, didn't hide behind her hair. "Are you nervous about graduation?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just making small talk, that he actually cared about her answer. "A little," she admitted, then surprising herself added, "I'm wearing something special, something that honors my family." His smile was genuine, soft around the edges. "I'd like to see it. I bet it's amazing." Before she could respond, the warning bell rang and students began flooding the hallways in their usual pre-class chaos, but as Liam walked away, he turned back. "See you in debate, Hana," and the way he said her name like it mattered, like she mattered, made something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with nerves. She was still thinking about that conversation when she got to gym class, where Coach Taylor, a stern woman with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing, had been doing stretching exercises. Hana moved through the routine, unconsciously, her body flowing into positions that felt natural as breathing, until she realized the entire class had stopped and was staring at her. Flexibility that came from years of Taekwondo training. Flexibility that most 17-year-old girls definitely didn't possess. "Nice form, Lee," Coach Taylor said, and there was something speculative in her voice, something that suggested she recognized what she was seeing. "You take dance classes?" "Something like that," Hana replied, settling back into anonymity as quickly as possible. But not before she caught the coach's knowing nod, the way her experienced eyes cataloged Hana's controlled breathing, her perfect posture, the discipline that radiated from every movement. Across the gym, she noticed Avery Daniels watching again, those blue eyes cold and calculating as they tracked Hana's every move, and when their gazes met, Avery's perfect lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile that made Hana's skin crawl with warning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of final exams and graduation preparations, but everywhere Hana went, she felt eyes on her, felt the weight of attention she'd spent 3 years avoiding. It should have been uncomfortable, should have made her want to shrink back into invisibility, but instead she found herself walking a little straighter, holding her head a little higher, as if Liam's words had planted something inside her that was beginning to grow. That evening, as she helped her mother close the laundromat, folding the last load of Mrs. Patterson's sheets and hanging Mr. Rodriguez's work shirts, Yoonji noticed the change too. "You seem different tonight," she said in Korean. Language they spoke when it was just the two of them, when they could let their American masks slip away. "Maybe I'm ready," Hana replied, also in Korean, her hands steady as she worked, ready to be seen. Her mother smiled, the first real smile Hana had seen from her in weeks. "Your father always said you would know when it was time to step into the light," he said. "You had the heart of a warrior, but the wisdom to choose your battles." "What if I'm not strong enough?" Hana asked the question that had been haunting her since she'd decided to wear the hanbok to graduation. "Strength is not about being feared, my daughter," Yoonji said, repeating words her husband had spoken so many times they'd become family scripture. "Strength is about being true to yourself, even when the world tells you to be someone else, especially then." As they walked home under the Texas stars, Hana felt something shifting inside her, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. She was tired of being invisible, tired of swallowing her words, tired of pretending she was less than she was. Tomorrow, she would submit her dress for approval, and Friday, she would walk across that graduation stage wearing her heritage like armor. But tonight, as she lay in bed, listening to her mother's sewing machine humming in the next room, adding final touches to a dress that was more than fabric, more than thread, she didn't know that across town, Avery Daniels was lying awake, planning something that would test every lesson her father had ever taught her, about strength and restraint, and the warrior's heart that beat steady and sure beneath her quiet exterior. The ambush came on Wednesday morning, disguised as concern, wrapped in fake smiles and honeyed voices that dripped poison. Hana was walking toward the main office to submit her dress for graduation approval, the garment bag draped carefully over her arm, when Avery Daniels materialized from the side hallway like a beautiful nightmare, flanked by her loyal followers. Kayla Martinez, with her nervous laugh and constant need for approval. Riley Thompson, whose daddy owned half the county and who wore her privilege like expensive perfume. And Jade Chun, the only other Asian girl in their class, who'd spent 4 years trying to prove she was different from quiet. Hana Lee. Oh my God, Hana, wait up. Avery called, her voice pitched to carry down the hallway, drawing attention from passing students. We heard you have something super special for graduation, and we just had to see. Hana's steps slowed, warning bells clanging in her mind. But she'd been trained to be polite, to smile and nod, and never make waves, so she stopped, turned around, even though every instinct her father had honed told her to run. It's just a dress, she said, keeping her voice level neutral. Just a dress, Avery repeated, her blue eyes glittering with something sharp and hungry. Oh honey, I doubt that, knowing you. It's probably some kind of cultural thing, right? Some kind of statement, the way she said cultural made it sound like a disease, something contagious and unwelcome. It's a hanbok-style dress, Hana said, lifting her chin slightly. It honors my heritage. Kayla giggled, the sound like breaking glass. Heritage, that's so cute, isn't it, girls, when people try to make everything about where they came from instead of just being normal. Can we see it? Riley asked, her tone deceptively sweet. I mean, if you're going to wear it to our graduation ceremony, don't you think we have a right to know what kind of spectacle you're planning? Hana's grip tightened on the garment bag, every fiber of her being screaming danger. But she was trapped in the middle of the hallway with curious students starting to gather, drawn by the scent of drama like sharks to blood. I don't think that's necessary, she said, but her voice came out smaller than she intended. Oh, but I insist, Avery said, stepping closer, and now Hana could smell her expensive perfume, could see the calculated cruelty in her perfect features. You see, my daddy sits on the school board, and he's very concerned about appropriate graduation attire. We wouldn't want anything too ethnic, too foreign, disrupting our ceremony. The words hit like physical blows, but Hana had learned to absorb pain, to let it wash over her without reacting. It follows all the guidelines, she said, though her hands were starting to shake. Let's just take a quick peek, Jade said, and there was something desperate in her voice, something that suggested she needed to prove her loyalty to Avery more than she needed to protect another girl who looked like her. Just to make sure. Before Hana could protest, Avery's manicured fingers were on the zipper, pulling it down with swift, violent motions, and the dress spilled out like a waterfall of pink silk and dreams. The embroidered flowers catching the fluorescent light, the traditional knots gleaming like small promises of beauty and belonging. Oh, Avery said, and her voice was soft, now dangerous. Oh, this is worse than I thought. This is definitely not appropriate for an American graduation ceremony. What happened next occurred in slow motion, like a nightmare sequence that Hana would replay in her mind for years to come. Riley produced scissors from her designer backpack, the kind with serrated edges meant for craft projects, and before Hana could move, could protest, could even breathe, the blades were slicing through silk, through thread, through months of her mother's careful work. Stop, Hana whispered, but the word was lost in the sound of fabric tearing, in Kayla's nervous laughter, in the growing murmur of the crowd that had gathered to watch the show. Jade grabbed a sleeve and pulled until the seam gave way with a sound like sobbing. Riley cut through the embroidered flowers, destroying hours of delicate stitching, while Avery directed the destruction with the calm efficiency of a general commanding troops. This is for your own good, Hana, she said, as pieces of the dress fell to the floor like broken dreams. You'll thank us later for saving you from embarrassing yourself. Hana stood frozen, not from fear, but from the discipline her father had drilled into her from years of learning to control her body, to breathe through pain, to never let emotion dictate action. Her hands were steady at her sides, but inside she was burning. Inside she was screaming. Inside something was breaking that had nothing to do with fabric and thread. There, said, stepping back to survey their handiwork. The dress now nothing but scraps and ruins scattered across the linoleum. Much better now. You can wear something normal, something that won't make everyone uncomfortable. The crowd had gone silent, students staring with expressions ranging from shock to pity to guilty fascination. No one moved to help, no one spoke in her defense. They just watched as Hana melt slowly, carefully gathering the pieces of her heritage. Her father's memory, her mother's love into her arms, cradling them like wounded birds. "You're welcome," Avery said, and turned away, her followers trailing behind her, like obedient shadows, but not before. Hana heard Riley whisper, "Did you see her?" "Face God, I almost feel bad," and Kayla's response, "Don't she brought this on herself, trying to be different." From the end of the hallway, hidden behind a cluster of lockers, Liam Alvarez watched the whole thing unfold, his phone in his hand, his finger on the record button, his heart pounding with rage and helplessness as he captured the final moments, the aftermath, the image of Hana Lee surrounded by the ruins of something beautiful, holding the pieces together with shaking hands, her face a mask of controlled devastation. The warning bell rang and students scattered like startled birds, leaving Hana alone in the hallway with her destroyed dress and her shattered dreams. But she didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break the way they expected her to. Instead, she stood slowly, the remnants of silk clutched against her chest, and walked toward the exit, her steps measured and controlled, her breathing steady and sure. Because Hana Lee was her father's daughter, and Kim Jae-sung had taught her that a warrior's strength was not in the fist, but in the choice of when to use it. And right now, surrounded by the wreckage of cruelty, she chose to be still, chose to breathe, chose to remember that this was not the end, but the beginning of something they could never imagine, something that would teach them the difference between breaking someone and forging them into steel. The walk home felt like walking underwater, every step heavy and strange, the torn pieces of her dress clutched against her chest like broken promises. She didn't remember the route, didn't remember unlocking the apartment door above the laundromat, didn't remember climbing the narrow stairs that creaked under her weight. But suddenly she was there, in her bedroom, surrounded by the familiar smell of fabric softener and her mother's jasmine tea, and the silence that always filled their small space during the afternoon. Lo Yoonji looked up from her sewing machine where she'd been hemming Mrs. Patterson's curtains, and the needle slipped from her fingers when she saw what Hana carried, saw the devastation written across her daughter's face in the careful control that spoke of training, of discipline, of a girl who'd learned too young how to swallow pain and keep breathing. "Hana," her mother whispered, rising from her chair with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years moving between languages, between worlds, between the daughter she'd raised and the woman that daughter was becoming. "What happened? What did they do?" But Hana couldn't speak, couldn't find words in English or Korean for the cruelty she'd witnessed the casual way. They'd destroyed months of work, years of meaning, generations of tradition, as if it were nothing, as if she were nothing. She sank to her knees on the worn carpet and spread the pieces out like a puzzle that could never be solved again. Silk and thread and love transformed into evidence of hatred. Her mother knelt beside her, and for a long moment, they sat in silence, their hands moving through the wreckage, cataloging the damage, the way soldiers might count their dead after battle. They said it wasn't appropriate. Hana finally managed, her voice raw and strange. They said it was too ethnic, too foreign for American graduation. Yoonji's face went very still, the way it did when she was calculating the cost of dry cleaning or deciding whether they could afford to fix the washing machine that had been making strange noises for weeks. But this stillness was different, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Who?" she said, and the single word carried the weight of 15 years in Texas. 15 years of biting her tongue and lowering her gaze and accepting less than she deserved. "Avery Daniels and her friends," Hana said, and saying the names aloud made them real, made the destruction real, made the humiliation settle into her bones like arthritis. "They had scissors, they planned it, they wanted to hurt me. Appa would not have stood for this," Yoonji said, using the Korean word for father that always made Hana's chest tight with missing. "Your father would have marched into that school and demanded justice. But Appa isn't here," Hana said, and the words came out harder than she intended, sharper than she meant to sound. "But grief was like that. Sometimes it cut you when you weren't expecting. It reminded you that some wounds never fully healed. And we can't fight the whole world, we can't make them accept us. Her mother was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands smoothing the torn silk as if she could will it back together. Through touch alone then, she stood and walked to the closet where she kept the memory box, the wooden chest that held photographs and letters and her late husband's Taekwondo belt, the black fabric worn soft from years of use. "Your father once told me that there are two kinds of strength," she said, pulling out the belt and holding it like a prayer. "The strength that demands to be seen and the strength that chooses when to reveal itself." Hana had heard this story before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like prophecy, like instruction manual for a war she didn't know she was fighting. He said, "You could break every board in the dojang, but if you broke them in anger, they were meaningless. But if you broke them with purpose, with intention, with love for what you were protecting, then they became something else entirely." "I don't want to break anything," Hana said. But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't true, knew that something inside her was already breaking, had been breaking for 3 years of swallowing her words and shrinking herself and pretending that invisible was safe, when invisible was just another kind of prison. "Then we rebuild," her mother said, settling back onto the floor, her knees creaking slightly. "We take what they destroyed and we make it into something they never expected, something they can't ignore or dismiss or pretend doesn't belong." They worked through the night, mother and daughter, their hands moving with shared purpose, cutting and piecing and reimagining what a dress could be, what a statement could look like, what armor might feel like when worn by someone who'd learned that strength wasn't about being bigger or louder or meaner than your enemies, but about being more yourself than they expected you to dare. Hana found herself thinking about her father's lessons, about the forms he'd taught her in their garage behind the laundromat, the way he'd made her practice the same kick 1,000 times until it became part of her breathing, until she could do it in her sleep, until her body knew what to do even when her mind was scared or confused or overwhelmed. "Pain is a teacher," he'd told her after her first sparring match, when she'd come home with bruised ribs and wounded pride. "But only if you listen to what it's trying to say, only if you let it make you stronger instead of smaller." As dawn crept through their small windows, painting everything pink and gold, Hana held up what they'd created, a dress that was part hanbok, part rebellion, part love letter to her father's memory, the silk panels they'd salvaged, stitched together with dark thread that looked like scars, but held everything together, made it stronger than it had been before the embroidered flowers. Now surrounded by stark geometric patterns, cut from her old Taekwondo uniforms, white cotton, that spoke of discipline and respect and the quiet power of knowing exactly who were. "It's not beautiful," she said, studying their work in the morning light. "No," her mother agreed, smoothing one last seam. "It's not beautiful, it's true, and truth is always more powerful than beauty. Truth is what your father died believing in. Truth is what we came to this country to find. What if they hate it? What if they call me names? What if they try to stop me from graduating? Then they will learn," Yoonji said with a smile that reminded Hana suddenly powerfully of her father's expression before he sparred with advanced students. "They will learn that you are Kim Jae-sung's daughter, and Kim Jae-sung taught his daughter that a warrior fights not to destroy, but to protect, not to prove superiority, but to claim the space she was always meant to occupy." Friday morning arrived wrapped in Texas heat and humidity that made even the air conditioner in their ancient Honda wheeze with effort as Hana drove the 10 minutes from the laundromat to Cedar Ridge High, her mother beside her wearing her best dress, navy blue with tiny white flowers and the jade earrings her own mother had given her when she'd married a man who dreamed of teaching martial arts to American children, who believed that strength could transcend language barriers. The dress hung in the backseat like a manifesto made of fabric and fury, not the delicate beauty they'd originally created, but something harder, more urgent, a patchwork of silk and cotton that told the story of destruction and resurrection of a girl who'd learned that sometimes you had to let yourself be broken before you could choose how to heal. "Remember," Yoonji said as they pulled into the school parking lot, already crowded with families carrying flowers and cameras and the particular mixture of pride and anxiety that marked every graduation ceremony. You wear this not for them, but for yourself, not to prove anything but to honor everything. Hana nodded, though her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the garment bag they'd sewn from canvas and determination. The weight of it familiar, now comforting, in the way her father's belt had been when she'd first tied it around her waist, and understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight looked different than you'd expected. The hallways buzzed with nervous energy, seniors hugging parents and taking selfies, and complaining about caps that wouldn't stay straight. But as Hana walked toward the designated changing area, she felt the ripple of attention that followed her, the way conversations paused, and eyes tracked her movement, the whispers that seemed to follow her like smoke in the girls' bathroom. She changed slowly, methodically, the way her father had taught her to prepare for competition. Each movement deliberate and controlled, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird demanding freedom. The dress fit differently now, hugged her frame in places that spoke of strength rather than submission. The white cotton panels, stark against the pink silk like declarations of war written in a language only she could read. When she emerged, the effect was immediate and electric. Students stopping mid-sentence, teachers pausing in their instructions, parents lowering their cameras to stare, not because the dress was beautiful, though it was in its fierce, unconventional way, but because it was impossible to ignore, impossible to dismiss, impossible to pretend belonged in the background where quiet girls were supposed to stay. "Jesus Christ," she heard someone whisper, and turned to see Liam Alvarez standing near the auditorium doors, his dark eyes wide with something that might have been awe or recognition, or the particular shock of seeing someone step fully into their power for the first time. "Hana, you look different," she supplied, because that was the only word that seemed to fit the way she felt, standing there in fabric that told her story in thread, that held her history in stitches that refused to hide. "Powerful," he corrected, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet that had fallen over their immediate area. "You look absolutely powerful." From across the hallway she saw Avery Daniels emerge from the opposite bathroom in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Hana's family made in a month, something designer and safe and completely forgettable, the kind of dress that whispered money and status and the comfortable assumption that some people simply mattered more than others. Their eyes met across the chaos of graduation preparation, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, predator and prey, except neither was quite sure anymore who was which. Avery's perfect features twisted into an expression of shock and something that might have been fear, because she'd destroyed Hana's dress, had taken scissors to silk and dreams, and somehow Hana was still here, still standing, still wearing her heritage like armor. "What the hell is that supposed to be?" Kayla Martinez whispered, loud enough to be heard, her voice carrying the edge of hysteria that came from realizing that some plans backfire, that some people refuse to stay broken, that sometimes quiet girls turn out to be anything but weak. "It's my choice," Hana said, and her voice carried too, steady and clear and utterly unashamed. "It's what I chose to wear to honor my father and my heritage and myself." The crowd was growing now, students and parents drawn by the tension, the scent of drama that hung in the air like ozone before a storm. But this time the attention didn't make Hana want to shrink, didn't make her want to disappear, because she was wearing truth, stitched together with love and determination, and the memory of a man who'd taught her that strength was always a choice. Coach Taylor appeared at her elbow, moving with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 30 years navigating high school politics and teenage drama. "Looking good, Lee," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's what I call owning your story." Principal Reyes emerged from his office, clipboard in hand, expression carefully neutral, the way administrators learned to look when they sensed trouble brewing, but weren't sure yet which side they needed to take. "Miss Lee," he said, "your dress, it's certainly unique. It follows all the guidelines," she replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Modest length, appropriate neckline, no offensive language or imagery." No, of course it does," he said quickly, because whatever else this was, it clearly wasn't a dress code violation. Wasn't anything he could object to on official grounds, even if it made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. It's just very distinctive. Yes, sir, she said, it is. And with that she turned and walked toward the auditorium, her mother beside her, Liam falling into step behind them, and somewhere in the crowd of watching faces, Avery Daniels stood frozen, realizing that destroying Hana's dress hadn't destroyed Hana at all, had maybe in fact created something far more dangerous than a quiet girl in pretty silk, something that looked like pride and felt like revolution, and wore its scars like medals earned in a war no one else had even known was being fought. The video uploaded at 11:47 p.m. Thursday night while Hana was sleeping. While Avery was at Kayla's house painting their nails and planning their post-graduation party, while the rest of Cedar Ridge High settled into dreams of caps and gowns and futures that stretched ahead like promises waiting to be kept or broken. But by Friday morning, it had already begun its digital journey through the interconnected web of teenage social media, moving from phone to phone like wildfire through dry grass. Liam had spent 3 hours editing it down to 90 seconds of devastating clarity. The shaky footage stabilized the audio, cleaned up the faces clearly visible as Avery directed the destruction of Hana's dress, as Riley wielded scissors like weapons, as Jade and Kayla laughed and grabbed and tore silk into ribbons, while other students watched without intervening, without protest, without the basic human decency to say, "Stop, this is wrong. This is cruel. This is everything that's poisonous about the way we treat each other." He'd uploaded it, anonymously of course, created a burner account with an email address that couldn't be traced back to him because he understood the politics of high school, knew that being the person who exposed the Golden Girls' cruelty would make him a target. But some things he'd realized, watching Hana gather the pieces of her destroyed dress, were more important than personal safety. Some things demanded witness, demanded justice, demanded the kind of exposure that sunlight brings to things that grow best in darkness. By morning it had 17 shares. By lunch it had 43. By the time graduation began at 2 o'clock, it had been viewed over 200 times and was spreading beyond Cedar Ridge High into the wider digital ecosystem where cruelty caught on camera had a way of taking on a life of its own. "Did you see it?" became the whispered question in every hallway conversation. "Did you see what they did to her dress? Did you see how she just stood there? Did you see the way they laughed?" And suddenly everyone had an opinion, everyone had a theory, everyone had something to say about the quiet Korean girl who'd been invisible until she wasn't, about the popular blonde who'd gone too far, about the kind of casual racism that existed in their small Texas town but usually stayed hidden behind polite smiles and coded language. Principal Reyes got the first call during third period from a parent who'd seen the video forwarded by her daughter, demanding to know what kind of school he was running, what kind of culture he was permitting, what kind of message this sent about tolerance and acceptance and basic human decency. Second call came 5 minutes later, then a third, then a fourth, until his secretary, Mrs. Henderson, was fielding calls faster than she could transfer them. "Get Daniels, Martinez, Thompson, and Chun to my office now," he told Assistant Principal Brooks, his usual calm cracking around the edges because whatever else this was, it was a public relations nightmare waiting to explode into something that could cost him his job, his reputation, his comfortable assumption that he ran a good school where good kids learned good values. Avery arrived first because she always did when authority called, still wearing the confidence that came from a lifetime of being untouchable, protected by her father's position and her mother's charity work, and the general assumption that pretty blonde girls from good families didn't do things like destroy other students' property for sport. But the confidence faltered when she saw Principal Reyes's expression when she saw the video playing on his computer screen, when she realized that her moment of casual cruelty had been preserved in digital amber for the world to see. "This is you," he said, and it wasn't a question. "This is you destroying another student's graduation dress. It was just a joke." She said automatically, the defense she'd been preparing since seeing the first text about the video. "We were just having fun. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal." "A joke," he repeated, and his voice was flat dangerous, destroying months of work. Destroying something with cultural significance, destroying another. Students' property and dignity, that's your idea of fun. Kayla arrived crying before she even sat down. Her mascara running in black streaks down her cheeks because she'd already gotten 3 calls from relatives who'd seen the video, already been told by her older sister that she looked like a monster that she'd embarrassed. Their family that she was grounded until she graduated college. Riley walked in with her lawyer. Mother trailing behind, demanding to know why her daughter was being singled out for what was clearly just teenage drama, blown out of proportion. But the bluster died when she saw the video, when she watched her own daughter laugh as silk tore, when she realized that no amount of money or influence could undo what had been captured on camera. Jade was the last to arrive and the quietest, sitting with her hands folded in her lap while her parents stood behind her chair, their faces carefully blank in the way of people who'd learned not to make waves, not to draw attention, not to give anyone reason to question their belonging. But this wasn't about belonging anymore. This was about accountability, about choices, about the difference between being accepted and accepting yourself. The video has been shared over 300 times. Principal Reyes said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent 20 years in education and thought he'd seen everything. It's been picked up by the local news station. I've had calls from parents, from school board members, from people I've never heard of asking how we're going to handle this situation. We could say it was taken out of context, Avery suggested, but her voice lacked its usual commanding tone, lacked the certainty that had always served as her armor. We could explain that we were just trying to help her fit in. By destroying her dress, he said. By mocking her heritage, by humiliating her in front of half the school. Help me understand how that was helping. The silence stretched like a wire pulled taut until Jade spoke so quietly they had to lean forward to hear her. "We can't explain it," she said, "because there is no explanation that makes what we did okay." Outside in the hallway, students were checking their phones, were sharing the video, were discovering that their classmates weren't who they'd pretended to be, that the social hierarchy they'd accepted without question was built on foundations of cruelty and exclusion that some of them had witnessed and said nothing about. That silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of participation, its own kind of guilt. And somewhere in the auditorium where graduation would begin in 3 hours, Hana Lee was adjusting the fit of her reconstructed dress, unaware that justice was spreading through fiber optic cables, that her story was reaching people she'd never meet, that her choice to stand in truth instead of hiding in shadows was teaching a whole community the difference between being popular and being powerful, between being liked and being respected, between being seen and being truly visible. The graduation ceremony had begun with pomp and circumstance echoing through the packed auditorium, families cramming into metal folding chairs that squeaked with every movement, cameras flashing like small explosions of joy and nervousness while Principal Reyes delivered his annual speech about bright futures and limitless possibilities. But Hana couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on the words that seemed to float around her like meaningless sounds, because the weight of attention was suffocating. The way people kept turning to stare at her dress, at her face, at the story written in silken cotton and stubborn pride that refused to be erased. She slipped out during the orchestra's rendition of Pomp and Circumstance, her reconstructed hanbok rustling softly as she made her way through the side door into the Texas heat that hit her like a physical force, the kind of oppressive humidity that made breathing feel like work. But at least here, she was alone. At least here, she could think without feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes cataloging her every movement, analyzing her every expression, trying to decode the message she wore like armor. The back of the school was deserted, most of the maintenance staff inside watching the ceremony or cleaning up after the reception that would follow. Families and faculty all gathered in air-conditioned comfort, while she stood in the shadow of the building where the dumpsters lived, where the rejected things went to wait for disposal. And wasn't that fitting? Wasn't that exactly where girls like Her were supposed to end up invisible and discarded and forgotten. She was adjusting the fit of her dress, smoothing the places where silk met cotton, where her mother's careful stitching held together pieces that had been meant to destroy her when she heard the sharp click of heels on concrete, the sound that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years, the sound of predators approaching with purpose and calculation, and the absolute certainty that their prey had nowhere left to run. Well, Avery's voice carried across the empty space, like poisoned honey, sweet on the surface but lethal underneath. If it isn't our little cultural ambassador, hiding out here in the trash where she belongs. Hana turned slowly, deliberately, the way her father had taught her to face opponents in sparring, never rushing, never showing fear, even when your heart was hammering against your ribs like a bird trying to break free from its cage. Avery stood 10 feet away, but she wasn't alone. Kayla and Riley flanked her like bodyguards, though their usual confidence seemed shaken, seemed fragile in the harsh afternoon light. Enjoying your moment of fame, Avery continued, stepping closer, her cream dress pristine and perfect and completely forgettable. The kind of outfit that whispered money and status without saying anything about the person wearing it. I saw the video. I saw what people are saying about us, about me. I didn't make the video. Hana said, her voice steady, though something inside her was coiling like a spring, compressed and ready. I didn't ask for any of this. But you're loving it, aren't you? Avery's perfect features twisted into something ugly, something that revealed the rot beneath the polished surface, getting to play the victim, getting sympathy from people who don't even know you, getting to pretend you're special when we both know what you really are. What am I? Hana asked, and the question hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 years of silence. 3 years of swallowed words. 3 years of pretending that cruelty was normal, that exclusion was acceptable, that some people simply mattered more than others. You're nothing, Avery snarled, and now her mask was completely gone. Now the real person stood exposed, raw and desperate and terrified. Because popularity built on cruelty was always fragile, always one viral video away from complete collapse. You're a weird, quiet nobody who thinks wearing some foreign costume makes her important, makes her belong somewhere she was never wanted. The words should have hurt, should have cut deep the way they were designed to do, but instead Hana felt something unexpected rising in her chest, something that felt like laughter, like relief, like the moment when you finally stop pretending to be smaller than you are and remember what you're actually capable of. You're right, she said, and Avery blinked clearly, not expecting agreement. I am quiet, and I was nobody, and I never thought I belonged here, but you know what I figured out these past few days? She took a step forward, and something in her posture must have changed, something in the way she carried herself, because Kayla actually stepped backward, fear flickering across her features like lightning. I figured out that belonging isn't something other people get to decide. For you, that being nobody is only true if you believe it, and that quiet doesn't mean weak, it just means I was choosing when to speak. Don't you dare, Avery said, and now her voice was shaking with rage, with desperation, with the particular fury of someone who'd spent their entire life believing they were untouchable. Discovering that power based on fear was just another kind of prison. Don't you dare try to turn this around, make yourself the hero of some inspirational story when you're just a pathetic little girl playing dress up. I'm not playing anything, Hana said, and her voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent years learning to control their body, their breathing, their reactions in preparation for moments exactly like this. I'm standing here wearing my heritage, my father's memory, my mother's love, and my own choice to be seen. Avery lunged forward, her manicured nails extended like claws, aiming for Hana's face, for the careful makeup her mother had applied that morning, for anything she could damage or destroy, because if she couldn't control the narrative, couldn't manage the fallout, couldn't make this situation disappear, then at least she could hurt the person who'd caused it. But Hana was ready, had been ready since she was 6 years old, since her father first taught her that violence was always a choice, and that choosing not to fight was sometimes the strongest option of all her body moved without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over as she shifted her weight, dropped into a stance that transformed her from target to something else entirely. Avery's swing passed harmlessly through empty air as Hana slipped aside, her movements fluid, controlled, precise. The way water flows around obstacles, the way wind bends trees without breaking them, and when Avery stumbled forward off balance and vulnerable, Hana could have ended. It could have demonstrated exactly why quiet girls with martial arts training were more dangerous than loud girls with attitude problems. Instead, she caught Avery's wrist gently, firmly, the way you might catch a falling child, and held it just long enough for the blonde girl to understand that she was completely outmatched. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Completely at the mercy of someone she'd spent 3 years treating like prey before releasing her and stepping back, "I could hurt you," Hana said. Softly, the words carrying more menace than any scream, any threat, any display of aggression ever could. "Could hurt you very badly, very easily, but I choose not to because that's not who I am, and it's not what my father taught me, and it's not what strength actually means." Avery stumbled backward, tears streaming down her perfect face makeup, running in black streaks that revealed the insecurity beneath the cruelty, the fear that drove the need to make others small. The desperate hollow ache of someone who'd built their entire identity on being better than people who were actually stronger, deeper, more real than she could ever hope to be. "You don't understand," she sobbed, the words coming out broken, desperate. "You don't understand what it's like to have everyone expecting you to be perfect, to never make mistakes, to always be the best at everything, when you know deep down that you're not special at all, that you're just ordinary, and if people figure that out, they'll stop paying attention and you'll disappear." Kayla and Riley stood frozen, watching their leader collapse, watching the hierarchy they'd built their teenage lives around crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane, and maybe understanding for the first time that strength wasn't about making other people smaller, wasn't about exclusion and cruelty and the desperate need to prove superiority. Maybe beginning to see that real power came from lifting others up, from creating space for everyone to be themselves, from choosing kindness even when it wasn't easy. "Everyone's ordinary," Hana said, and her voice was gentle, now compassionate in the way that only people who'd survived real loss, real pain, could manage. "Everyone's scared, everyone's trying to figure out where they belong. But tearing other people down doesn't make you taller, it just makes the world smaller, meaner, uglier than it has to be." She turned to walk away, then paused, looked back at the 3 girls who'd tormented her, who'd tried to erase her, who'd learned too late that some people can't be broken, only transformed. "I forgive you," she said, and the words hit harder than any punch, any kick, any demonstration of physical superiority ever could. "Not because you deserve it, but because carrying anger around is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die, and I refuse to let your fear poison my joy." As she walked back toward the auditorium, toward the ceremony where her name would be called, where she would cross the stage wearing truth and pride and the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly who she was meant to be, she heard Avery's sobs echoing off the brick walls, heard Riley whisper, "Oh God, what have we done?" heard Kayla say, "She could have destroyed us, she could have hurt us, and she just walked away." And maybe that was the most powerful thing of all. Maybe that was the lesson her father had been trying to teach her all along, that real strength wasn't about winning fights. It was about choosing not to fight when you knew you could win. That true power came not from making others afraid, but from refusing to be afraid yourself. That the strongest response to hatred was always love, even when love looked like walking away, even when love meant forgiving people who thought forgiveness was weakness, when really it was the most radical, powerful choice a person could make. Monday morning arrived like the aftermath of a hurricane, everything looking the same on the way surface, but fundamentally changed in ways that would take months to fully understand. Cedar Ridge High buzzed with an energy that felt different. Electric charged with the kind of tension that comes when long-held assumptions crumble when power. Structures built on fear and exclusion suddenly reveal themselves as fragile as spun glass and twice as dangerous when shattered. The video had exploded over the weekend, shared beyond their small Texas town, picked up by local news stations, then regional ones. Then somehow finding its way into the vast digital ecosystem were stories about bullying and redemption and quiet. Girls who turned out to be stronger than anyone imagined had a way of capturing the collective consciousness, touching something deep and universal about the human experience of being different, of being targeted, of finding the courage to stand up and claim the space you'd always been meant to occupy. Principal Reyes arrived to find protesters in his parking lot, 37 people carrying signs that read, "Stop bullying now," and "Cultural pride not cultural shame," and "Hana Lee is our hero," while local news crews set up cameras and reporters practiced their opening lines about racism in small town schools, about the power of social media to expose injustice, about the difference between consequence and accountability. Inside the building, everything felt off-kilter, wrong in the way that familiar places feel when something fundamental is shifted, when the rules everyone thought they understood suddenly no longer apply. Avery's locker stood empty, cleaned out over the weekend, along with Kayla's and Riley's and Jade's, their absence, creating a vacuum that other students moved around carefully, as if the space itself might be contaminated with the kind of cruelty that destroys silk dresses and assumes destruction is entertainment. The disciplinary hearing had been swift, brutal in its efficiency. Avery and her followers suspended for the remaining 3 days of school, their graduation participation revoked, their college recommendation letters pulled, their carefully constructed facades of popularity and perfection stripped away to reveal the hollow, desperate insecurity beneath all their cruelty, all their need to make others small, to make themselves feel large. But the real fallout went deeper than disciplinary action, deeper than viral videos and news coverage, and the sudden, uncomfortable awareness that their school had become a symbol of everything wrong with teenage culture in modern America. It went to the heart of how they saw themselves, how they treated difference, how they defined strength and belonging, and the basic human obligation to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Coach Taylor found Hana in the gym during lunch period, sitting alone on the bleachers, where she'd eaten countless silent meals over 3 years of high school, watching other people's conversations, other people's friendships, other people's easy, casual belonging, with the detached observation of someone who'd learned early that participation wasn't always possible, but witness was always a choice. "Heard you handled yourself pretty well Friday afternoon," the coach said, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone whose knees remembered every year of running drills and breaking up fights and trying to teach teenagers that physical strength without emotional discipline was just another form of weakness. "I didn't fight," Hana said, because that seemed important to clarify, seemed like the distinction her father would have wanted her to make. "I could have, but I didn't." "Exactly, Coach." Taylor nodded approval, radiating from her weathered features. "That's what real strength looks like, knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to, knowing you have power and using it to protect instead of harm. That's the difference between a warrior and a bully." The words settled into Hana's chest like small warm stones, building something solid and unshakable in the place where doubt used to live, where the constant question of whether she belonged, whether she mattered, whether her quiet presence had any value at all, had gnawed at her confidence for 3 long years. "Principal Reyes wants to see you," Coach Taylor continued, "wants you to speak at the emergency assembly tomorrow morning about bullying, about standing up for yourself, about what happened Friday afternoon." Hana's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety, the old instinct to shrink, to deflect, to find ways to become invisible. Again warring with something newer, something that felt like responsibility, like the weight of representing more than just herself, representing every quiet kid, every different kid, every student who'd ever been made to feel small for refusing to pretend they were something they weren't, What would I say? She asked because speaking to 300 people felt impossible, felt like the kind of attention that would burn her alive with its intensity. The truth, Coach Taylor said simply. Just tell them what you learned, what you want them to know about strength, about choosing who you want to be, instead of letting other people choose for you. That evening, Hana sat at her mother's sewing machine, not working on any particular project. Just running fabric through her fingers, feeling the texture of different materials: cotton rough and honest, silk smooth, and elegant polyester, practical and forgiving, each one beautiful in its own way, each one serving its own purpose in the vast tapestry of possibility. Yoonji worked beside her, hemming a customer's dress, her movements precise, economical, the result of 20 years spent making other people's clothes fit better, making their lives a little easier, a little more beautiful. And maybe that was a kind of strength, too. Maybe that was its own form of quiet heroism. The daily choice to create beauty, to solve problems, to make the world a little bit better, one careful stitch at a time. Appa would be proud, her mother said without looking up from her work. Not because you could have hurt those girls, but because you chose not to. Because you chose to be bigger than their fear, bigger than their need to make you small. I'm scared about tomorrow, Hana admitted, because fear was still fear, even when you'd learned to act in spite of it, even when you'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of terror, but the decision to move forward anyway. Good. Yoonji smiled, the expression transforming her tired features into something radiant, something that reminded Hana powerfully of her father's face when he'd watched her nail a particularly difficult form, when he'd seen her choose discipline over impulse, restraint over revenge. Fear means it matters, means what you're about to do has weight, has consequence, has the power to change things. The next morning, Hana stood backstage in the auditorium, listening to the murmur of voices beyond the curtain. 300 students and 50 faculty members waiting to hear what she had to say, waiting for wisdom from a girl who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, who'd never asked to be a symbol, never wanted to represent anything more than her own quiet determination to graduate with dignity intact. She thought about her father's lessons, about the forms he'd taught her, about the way movement could become meditation, could become prayer, could become the physical expression of internal truth. And maybe speaking was just another kind of form, another way of moving through space with intention and purpose, and the absolute certainty that you had every right to take up the space you occupied. Principal Reyes introduced her with words like courage and resilience, and the kind of strength that transforms communities. But as Hana walked to the podium, she carried only her own truth, only the story of a girl who'd learned that being different wasn't a flaw to hide, but a gift to share, that being quiet didn't mean being weak, that belonging wasn't something other people granted you, but something you claimed for yourself. My name is Hana Lee, she began, and her voice carried clearly through the auditorium, steady and sure, and completely unashamed. And I want to tell you about the difference between being invisible and being unseen, about choosing who you want to be instead of letting fear make that choice for you, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to hurt anyone to prove it exists. The auditorium felt different. 3 days later, transformed from a place of confrontation and consequence into something that hummed with possibility, with the particular energy that graduation ceremonies carry, the weight of endings and beginnings twisted together like DNA strands, encoding the future in the choices made in high school hallways, the lessons learned, not just from textbooks, but from the daily practice of becoming human in a world that often seemed designed to reward cruelty over kindness, conformity over authenticity, fear over love. Hana sat in the third row between Marcus Williams, who'd spent 4 years building robots in the engineering lab, and Sarah Chun, who wrote poetry that made teachers cry and wasn't related to Jade. Despite sharing a surname, despite the assumption that all Asian students must somehow be connected, when the only thing they'd ever shared was the particular burden of being visible in ways they couldn't control, invisible in ways that mattered. The dress she wore today was her third creation, born from the ashes of the original hanbok and the defiant patchwork of Friday's confrontation. This version somehow managed to honor both the traditional elegance her mother had envisioned and the hard-won strength that came from being broken and choosing how to heal. The silk panels flowing like water over cotton that spoke of discipline and training. The embroidered flowers now surrounded by geometric patterns that looked like the Korean flag's trigrams, but spelled out in her father's native script words that meant strength in stillness. And the warrior's heart beat steady. She'd spent Monday evening after her speech at the emergency assembly working on it with her mother, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, the way they had for 3 years every evening after closing the laundromat. Two women building something beautiful from the remnants of destruction, proving that creation was always possible even when it seemed like the world was determined to tear everything apart. The assembly had gone better than she'd expected, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about the difference between being seen and being truly visible. About the way silence could be its own form of strength when it was chosen rather than imposed, about the particular courage required to remain kind in a world that often mistook kindness for weakness and cruelty for power. She'd talked about her father's lessons, about the discipline that came from martial arts training, but more importantly about the discipline that came from choosing who you wanted to be every single day, even when that choice was difficult, even when it would have been easier to shrink, to disappear, to let other people's fear determine the boundaries of your existence. The response had been immediate, overwhelming, students approaching her afterward to share their own stories of being different, of being targeted, of learning to find strength in places they'd never thought to look. And maybe that was the real power of speaking truth. Maybe that was why her voice had carried so clearly through the auditorium, because she wasn't just telling her story, she was giving other people permission to claim their own stories, to step into their own light, to believe that being different wasn't a flaw to hide, but a gift the world desperately needed. Now, as Principal Reyes began calling names in alphabetical order, Hana felt the familiar flutter of nerves, the instinctive desire to blend into the crowd, to let this moment pass without drawing attention to herself. But that impulse felt different, now felt like an old habit she'd outgrown rather than a survival mechanism she needed to maintain. She was ready to be seen, ready to walk across that stage wearing her heritage, like armor carrying her father's memory, like a blessing accepting the diploma that represented not just 4 years of high school, but 3 years of choosing to stay quiet and 1 week of learning to speak. Hana Lee, Principal Reyes called, and his voice carried warmth, approval, the particular satisfaction of an educator who'd watched a student transform from invisible to undeniable, not through seeking attention, but through accepting the attention that truth naturally attracts. She stood, and the auditorium erupted, not in polite applause, but in something that felt like celebration, like recognition, like the sound 300 people make when they witness someone step fully into their power for the first time. Students who'd ignored her for 3 years, now cheering for the girl who'd shown them what real strength looked like. Teachers who'd barely noticed her quiet presence, now standing to honor the young woman who'd reminded them why they'd chosen education in the first place. Parents who didn't know her story, but recognized courage when they saw it. As she walked across the stage, the silk of her dress caught the auditorium lights, the embroidered flowers seeming to glow with their own internal fire, the geometric patterns that honored her father's teaching, creating a visual rhythm that spoke of discipline and beauty and the particular grace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. Principal Reyes shook her hand and pressed the diploma into her palm, the weight of it somehow both lighter and heavier than she'd expected, a piece of paper that represented everything she'd survived, everything she'd learned, everything she'd become in the crucible of high school, where difference was often treated as disease, where quiet was mistaken for weakness, where the choice to remain kind in the face of cruelty was seen as surrender rather than victory. "Congratulations, Miss Lee," he said, and his words carried deeper meaning than the simple acknowledgement of academic achievement, carried recognition of the strength it had taken to reach this moment, to stand here wearing truth instead of hiding from it, to accept visibility instead of seeking invisibility to claim the space. She'd always been meant to occupy. The standing ovation continued as she walked back to her seat, the sound washing over her like water. Like benediction, like the collective exhale of a community that had learned something important about itself, about the difference between popularity and respect, about the way real power lifted others up instead of tearing them down, about the kind of strength that didn't need to hurt anyone to prove it existed. In the audience, she spotted her mother wiping tears from her cheeks, the jade earrings catching the light as she clapped with the fierce pride of a woman who'd sacrificed everything to give her daughter the chance to become whoever she was meant to be. Beside her sat Coach Taylor and Mr. Perez, who'd driven down from Austin to watch his former student graduate, the man who'd continued her father's teachings after death had interrupted them, who'd helped her understand that martial arts wasn't about fighting, but about the discipline to choose when not to fight. Liam caught her eye from 2 rows ahead, and his smile carried warmth, admiration, the particular recognition that passes between people who've witnessed each other's transformation, who've seen past surfaces to the strength beneath. He'd given her a gift with that video, not just exposure of injustice, but the evidence that someone had been watching, someone had cared enough to capture the truth and share it with the world. As the ceremony continued with the final speeches and the traditional throwing of caps that turned the air into a storm of black squares and tassels and dreams made manifest, Hana felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like peace, like completion, like the moment when a long journey finally reaches its destination. She was no longer invisible, but she was also no longer afraid of being seen. She'd learned that strength wasn't about being bigger or louder or meaner than your enemies, but about being more yourself than they expected you to dare, about wearing your heritage like armor, your scars like medals, your quiet dignity like a crown that no one could take away, because it had been earned through survival, through choice, through the daily practice of remaining kind in a world that often rewarded cruelty. The diploma in her hands represented more than 4 years of high school, more than the classes she'd passed and the tests she'd taken. It represented the girl who'd learned to be invisible and the young woman who'd chosen to be seen, the daughter who'd honored her father's memory and the student who'd taught her community about the difference between winning and being right, about the power of forgiveness and the strength that comes from choosing who you want to be instead of letting fear make that choice for you. As families and graduates spilled out into the Texas evening, where the heat was finally beginning to break, where the first stars were appearing in a sky that stretched endless and full of possibility, Hana Lee stood in her reconstructed hanbok, surrounded by people who saw her, truly saw her, and realized that this wasn't an ending at all, but a beginning, the first day of a life lived in full visibility, full authenticity, full ownership of the space she'd always been meant to occupy in a world that desperately needed the kind of quiet strength she'd learned to carry, like prayer, like possibility, like the promise that being different wasn't a flaw to hide, but a gift the future was waiting to receive. Dojang looked smaller than Hana remembered, but then again, everything from childhood had a way of shrinking when you returned with adult eyes, with the weight of experience pressing down on memories that had been preserved in amber for 3 years. Since her father's death, since the last time she'd walked through these doors, carrying grief so heavy it felt like drowning, carrying questions about strength and purpose, and whether the lessons he'd taught her would be enough to navigate a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty over kindness, conformity over authenticity, the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. It was barely dawn on the Saturday morning, 1 week after graduation, the Texas heat already beginning to build even at 6 a.m., but inside the training space, the air conditioning hummed quietly, creating a sanctuary of controlled temperature and filtered light, where the outside world couldn't intrude, where the noise of small-town gossip and viral videos, and the particular chaos that came from becoming visible when you'd spent years perfecting invisibility, couldn't penetrate. The sacred space where bodies learned to move with intention, where minds learned to still themselves, where spirits learned that Strength wasn't about dominating others, but about mastering yourself. Mr. Perez had given her the keys Friday evening when she'd called to ask permission to use the space for what she described as something I need to do alone. And he'd understood. Without explanation, the way martial arts instructors learn to read their students. Needs the way fathers figure out when their children need space to work, through problems that words can't solve, and maybe that was why he'd driven down from Austin. For her graduation, maybe that was why he'd continued teaching her after her father died, because he recognized that some students carried more than technique, carried legacy, carried the responsibility of honoring the dead by living fully, by choosing strength over fear, by becoming the person their teachers had seen in them, even when they couldn't see it themselves. She changed into her dobok in the small bathroom that still smelled faintly of the disinfectant her father had used every evening. After classes, the white cotton soft from years of washing familiar against her skin, like a second self, like the physical manifestation of discipline and respect, and the particular humility that came from understanding that true power was always in service of something larger than yourself, larger than ego, larger than the need to prove superiority or dominance or the right to take up space in a world that often seemed determined to shrink anyone who dared to be different, the mirrors reflected. Back a young woman, she was still learning to recognize someone who looked like the quiet girl who'd spent 3 years fading into backgrounds, but carried herself with a new certainty, a new ownership of her own presence, the way her shoulders no longer curved inward in an attempt to make herself smaller, the way her eyes met their own reflection without flinching, without the automatic impulse to look away, to deflect, to pretend that visibility was dangerous when really it was just unfamiliar. Just another skill that required practice like any other. She began with basic forms, moving through the patterns her father had taught her when she was 6 years old, and grief was too big for a child's vocabulary when movement became the language they shared, when the repetition of kick, block, punch became meditation, became prayer, became the physical expression of everything he wanted her to remember about strength, about control, about the warrior's responsibility to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than tear down, to choose mercy, even when mercy looked like weakness to people who'd never understood the difference between being powerful and being cruel. The movements flowed like water, like breathing, like muscle memory that lived deeper than conscious thought, her body remembering not just the techniques but the feeling of her father's hands guiding her stance, adjusting her form, correcting her balance with the patient repetition of someone who understood that mastery wasn't about perfection, but about the willingness to begin again every day, to return to basics, to honor the foundation, even when the world wanted you to skip ahead to the flashy moves, to the dramatic displays, to the kind of strength that announced itself with violence rather than the quiet confidence that needed no announcement at all. As she moved through the forms, she felt layers of tension leaving her body, stress she hadn't realized she was carrying dissolving like salt in warm water, the hypervigilance that had kept her safe for 3 years of high school, the constant awareness of who was watching, who was judging, who might decide that her difference was threatening enough to warrant destruction, the exhausting work of monitoring her own visibility, of calculating when to speak, when to stay silent, when to blend in, when to stand out, all of it flowing out of her with each controlled movement, each deliberate breath, each moment of perfect stillness between actions. The advanced forms came next, patterns her father had taught her in the months before his death, when he'd begun to sense that time was running short, when he'd pushed her harder, not out of impatience, but out of love, out of the desperate need to give her every tool she might need to navigate a world without his protection, his guidance, his steady presence reminding her that strength was always a choice, that power was always a responsibility, that the warrior's greatest victory was knowing when not to fight. Her kicks cut through the air with precision that would have impressed her father, made him proud, not because of their potential for damage, but because of their control, because every movement demonstrated the discipline he'd tried to instill, the understanding that technique without wisdom was just violence with better form, that knowing how to hurt someone and choosing not to was the foundation of every meaningful relationship, every peaceful community, every society that chose to lift people up rather than tear them down. She sparred with memory, with the shadow of every opponent she'd ever faced, in competition with the ghosts of everyone who'd tried to make her smaller, quieter, less visible than she was meant to be. And in each imaginary exchange, she practiced not winning, but responding, practicing the difference between reacting from fear and acting from strength, practicing the art of remaining centered even when the world around you was chaos, even when people you'd never hurt decided you were their enemy, even when kindness was mistaken for weakness and mercy was seen as surrender. By the time she finished, the sun was higher, sending streams of golden light through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny celebrations, like the physical manifestation of possibility and change, and the particular magic that happened when someone chose to honor their past while stepping fully into their future, when tradition became not a cage but a foundation, not a limitation but a launching point for becoming whoever you were meant to be. She sat in seiza position, facing the small altar Mr. Perez maintained in the corner of the dojang, where photos of former masters looked down with expressions of serene authority, where incense burned in thin streams of fragrant smoke, where offerings of fruit and flowers reminded everyone who entered that martial arts was not just about physical technique, but about spiritual discipline, about the connection between body and mind, and the responsibility that came with any form of power. Her father's photo occupied the place of honor among the masters, his face younger than she remembered him, but wearing the same expression of patient strength that had defined every lesson, every conversation, every moment of guidance he'd offered during their too brief time together. And as she looked at him, now she realized that she was no longer the grieving child who'd lost her teacher, no longer the angry teenager who'd felt abandoned by his death, no longer the frightened girl who'd wondered if his lessons would be enough to protect her from a world that seemed designed to destroy anything different, anything beautiful, anything that refused to conform to expectations that had never been meant for people like her. "I did it, Appa," she whispered in Korean, the language of her heritage, the language of her father's birth, the language that carried weight and meaning that English somehow couldn't hold. "I graduated. I stood up for myself. I chose to be seen, and I didn't break, and I didn't let them break me." The silence that followed felt full rather than empty, felt like listening rather than absence, felt like the moment between question and answer, when understanding arrives not through words, but through the deep recognition that some truths can only be lived rather than spoken, only demonstrated through action rather than explained through philosophy, only embodied through the daily choice to be kind in a cruel world, to be strong without being hard, to be visible without being loud. She pulled the graduation tassel from her pocket, the gold cord and 2025 charm catching the morning light, the physical symbol of everything she'd survived, everything she'd learned, everything she'd become in the crucible of Cedar Ridge High, where difference was often treated as disease, where quiet was mistaken for weakness, where the choice to remain authentic in the face of pressure to conform had required more courage than she'd known she possessed. Placing it at the base of her father's photo felt like completion, like the closing of a circle that had begun with his first lesson about strength and stillness, and the Thaiva closing like the Svinfa circle that had begun with his first lesson about strength and stillness, and that strength and stillness, and the completion. Warrior's responsibility to protect rather than destroy. She could almost hear his voice reminding her that ceremonies were important, not because they changed anything, but because they marked the moment when internal transformation became visible, when private growth stepped into public acknowledgement, when the work of becoming yourself finally resulted in the courage to be yourself. "Thank you," she said to the photo, to the memory, to the lessons that lived in her bones, in her breathing, in her ability to stand still in the center of chaos and choose response over reaction. "Thank you for teaching me that being strong doesn't mean being hard, that being powerful doesn't mean being cruel, that being visible doesn't mean being loud. The drive back to the laundromat took her through the center of Cedar Ridge, where early morning shoppers were beginning to emerge, where the weekend farmers market was setting up in the town square, where life continued its ordinary rhythm as if nothing had changed, as if a quiet girl hadn't discovered that she was never meant to be invisible, as if the video of her confrontation with Avery wasn't still circulating through social media, teaching people across the country about the difference between revenge and justice, between breaking someone and helping them understand their own brokenness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Liam, who'd been checking on her every day since graduation, with messages that were careful not to push but consistent enough to let her know that someone was thinking about her, someone cared about her journey, someone understood that transformation was a process, not an event, that healing took time, that becoming visible after years of invisibility required adjustment period, support system, people who saw you truly and loved what they saw, ready for what's next. The message read, and she smiled at the question that assumed there would be a next, that assumed her story was beginning rather than ending, that assumed the girl who'd worn her heritage like armor and chosen mercy over revenge had more to offer the world than just her ability to survive high school bullying, to transform cruelty into wisdom, to teach a community about the difference between being popular and being powerful. She didn't answer immediately because the question deserved consideration, deserved the kind of careful thought her father had taught her to give to important decisions, but she saved the message, marked it as important, added it to the collection of digital kindnesses that had sustained her through the aftermath of going viral, through the strange experience of becoming a symbol, when all she'd ever wanted was to honor her heritage and graduate with dignity intact at home. She found her mother in the kitchen preparing breakfast with the careful attention to detail that characterized everything Yoonji did, from hemming pants to raising a daughter to building a life in a country that had never quite felt like home, but had become home anyway through the daily choice to bloom, where you were planted to create beauty in unexpected places, to find strength in community, even when community had to be built from scratch. "How was the dojang?" her mother asked without looking up from the eggs. She was scrambling the question, carrying layers of meaning, because she understood that some visits were about technique and others were about memory, and this one had clearly been about memory, about honoring the past while preparing for the future, about the particular closure that came from returning to the place where your strength was born. "Peaceful," Hana said, settling at the small table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where her mother had helped her with homework and listened to her practice speeches and witnessed her slow transformation from grieving child to determined teenager to young woman who understood that being different was not a flaw to hide but a gift to share. "I think Appa would be proud. I know he would be proud," Yoonji corrected with the certainty of someone who'd loved Kim Jae-sung for 15 years, who'd watched him teach their daughter not just martial arts, but life philosophy, who'd seen his face light up every time Hana mastered a new form, demonstrated a new level of control, showed that she understood the deeper lessons about strength and responsibility and the warrior's code that protected rather than destroyed. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the sounds of morning traffic outside their window and the gentle hum of the air conditioning, and the particular peace that came from being understood, being accepted, being loved for exactly who you were, rather than who someone thought you should become. And maybe that was the real lesson. Maybe that was what her father had been trying to teach her all along, that home wasn't a place, but a feeling, that belonging wasn't something other people granted you, but something you created for yourself and the people you chose to love. After breakfast, Hana climbed the stairs to her bedroom, where her graduation dress hung in the closet, next to the remnants of the original hanbok, next to the sketches and fabric samples that represented dreams deferred and dreams realized, and the particular creativity that came from learning to see destruction as opportunity, to see endings as beginnings, to see every apparent defeat as information about what needed to change. She pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing, not with any particular goal in mind, but with the fluid, unconscious movement of someone whose hands knew how to translate feeling into form, how to make visible the invisible, how to give shape to the shapeless emotions that had been building in her chest since graduation, since the moment she'd realized that her story was not ending but transforming, not concluding but expanding into something larger than she'd ever imagined. The dress that emerged on paper was unlike anything she'd created before. Bold where her previous designs had been subtle, flowing where they had been structured, confident where they had been careful. It combined elements of traditional Korean hanbok with modern American silhouettes, mixed her father's discipline with her own emerging sense of style, spoke in a visual language that was entirely her own, entirely authentic, entirely unafraid of taking up space, of being seen, of claiming the right to exist exactly as she was, without apology, without explanation, without the exhausting work of making herself smaller to make others more comfortable. As she worked, she felt her phone buzz with notifications, messages from classmates she'd barely spoken to in 3 years, people who wanted to congratulate her on her speech, on her strength, on her grace under pressure, people who said they'd been inspired by her story, people who admitted they'd been bystanders to bullying and promised to do better, people who understood that her victory was not just personal but communal, not just individual but representative of everyone who'd ever been made to feel small for being different. There were messages from strangers to people who'd seen the video and felt moved to reach out to share their own stories of being bullied, of finding strength in unexpected places, of learning that survival was just the first step and thriving was the real challenge, the real victory, the real way to honor everyone who'd tried to break you, by proving that breaking was never permanent, that healing was always possible, that becoming yourself was worth whatever pain. The process required the college acceptance letters she'd received still sat unopened on her desk, because the future felt simultaneously urgent and spacious, like something that required immediate attention and infinite patience, like a puzzle that would solve itself if she just kept showing up, kept choosing authenticity over safety, kept believing that the world needed whatever gift she'd been born to give. Her mother's voice drifted up from downstairs, speaking Korean to someone on the phone, probably her sister in Seoul, probably sharing news about the graduation, about the dress, about the daughter who'd learned to stand tall in a country that had tried to make her small. And maybe that was part of the gift too, maybe part of her purpose was to be proof that immigration success couldn't be measured just in financial terms or educational achievements, but in the ability to raise children who knew their worth, who claimed their space, who honored their heritage while building their own paths. Evening came with the particular golden light that Texas was famous for, the kind of sunset that made even strip malls look beautiful, that transformed ordinary moments into something that felt sacred, felt significant, felt like the perfect ending to a day spent honoring the past and dreaming about the future. And as Hana looked out her bedroom window at the town that had tried to erase her and failed, she felt something that might have been forgiveness, might have been gratitude, might have been the simple recognition that everything had happened exactly as it needed to happen to bring her to this moment, this understanding, this peace. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was her mother calling her down to the living room where she'd been working on something all afternoon, something she'd kept hidden, covered with an old sheet, the way she did when she was creating surprise gifts, the way she'd done when Hana was small and birthdays were magic. And the future stretched ahead like an unopened present waiting to be discovered. "Come," Yoonji said, when Hana appeared at the top of the stairs. "I want to show you something." The family altar had been rearranged, expanded to include a new frame, placed in the position of honor next to her father's photo, the graduation picture taken when Principal Reyes handed her the diploma captured the exact moment when the auditorium erupted in applause, when 300 people stood to honor not just her academic achievement, but her courage, her grace, her refusal to let cruelty define her story. "You belong here," her mother said, and her voice carried the weight of 15 years in America, 15 years of building a life from scratch, of raising a daughter alone, of choosing hope over fear every single day, You belong with the ancestors, with the people who came before you, who chose strength over surrender, who chose love over hate, who chose to be exactly who they were meant to be, no matter what the world said about it. As they stood together in the soft light of evening, looking at the altar that held their family's history, their dreams, their losses, their victories, Hana felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place, felt the last question mark straighten into an exclamation point, felt the story that had begun with a torn dress transform into something larger than trauma, larger than triumph, larger than any single moment of cruelty or courage. She was Hana Lee, daughter of Kim Jae-sung and Yoonji Lee, graduate of Cedar Ridge High, student of Taekwondo, keeper of traditions, creator of new possibilities, young woman who'd learned that strength was not about being unbreakable, but about choosing how to heal when you broke. That power was not about making others small, but about helping them remember their own largeness. That belonging was not about fitting in, but about having the courage to stand out. Tomorrow there would be decisions to make. About college, about the future, about what came next in a life that had suddenly expanded from the careful limitations of invisibility to the vast possibilities of being seen. But tonight there was just this moment, this peace, this understanding that she was exactly where and who she was meant to be. Her phone buzzed one more time with another message from Liam. Ready for what's next? But this time she knew the answer, knew it with the certainty that came from standing in your own truth, from claiming your own space, from understanding that the warrior's greatest victory was not conquering others, but conquering the fear that made you smaller than you were meant to be. She was ready, not because she had all the answers, but because she'd learned that having all the answers was less important than having the courage to ask new questions, not because the path ahead was clear, but because she'd discovered that clarity came from walking, not from standing, still not from planning every step, but from trusting that each step would teach her what she needed to know for the next one. The future stretched ahead, vast and uncertain and full of possibility, and Hana Lee walked toward it, wearing her heritage like armor, her scars like medals, her quiet strength like a crown that no one could take away, because it had been earned through survival, through choice, through the daily practice of being exactly who she was meant to be in a world that desperately needed the gift of her authentic self. She was ready. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.